For the past 20 years, Brett has served as the president of RARE, a U.S.-based environmental nonprofit that helps communities adopt sustainable practices. The organization is rooted in the belief that most threats to the environment are caused by human behavior, so solving these challenges means changing those behaviors.
Essentially what we do is we make becoming a conservationist really easy, really exciting, really compelling. So around the world, from China to Indonesia to Brazil to Mozambique, we partner with local political leaders, we partner with local environmental leaders, with local community leaders, and we help give them the skills, the motivation, the practices needed essentially to create a greater understanding of why nature is so important, to create a greater understanding of the challenges that nature faces, but without overemphasizing the plight of nature and the problems that we face. We give a sense of hope and opportunity. We do that a couple of ways. First, I think what we're best at RARE is what we would call human behavior change for the environment. And essentially it's this notion that people, once they recognize the value of nature, are somehow inspired, their hearts and their minds can wrap around the notion that they have a singular role to play and a singular contribution to make in order to preserve the natural resources on which their culture or their happiness or their economies depend. And we call these pride campaigns. So the notion is that you train local leaders and you equip them to use commercial marketing practices to commercialize, to market this notion that nature is really important, that it's under siege, and that there's a lot we can do about it. So that's instilling a sense of pride in nature, which is one way of winning people's hearts. Now, to get to their minds, things get a little more complicated, and that requires providing some evidence, what we call a bright spot, some glimmer of hope that some community somewhere else has confronted the same challenge and has been able to address it.
One priority for RARE is marine life conservation. Oceans cover more than 2/3 of our planet. But around the world, overfishing, pollution, and increased temperatures are threatening water quality and the animals in these waters. RARE works with coastal communities to identify economic incentives for preserving marine life.
Several years ago, we got really interested in the plight of the ocean, and in particular, something that most people don't recognize, that most of the coral reefs and the seagrass beds and what we would associate with the most beautiful parts of the ocean along the coasts of the developing world are also some of the richest places on Earth from a marine biodiversity standpoint. These are also some of the most productive ecosystems. They produce a lot of fish that feeds 1 billion of the world's poorest people. So if you can inspire communities living along coastlines to recognize, well, they're overfishing, they've got a challenge. They've got an opportunity to do fish differently, to better manage their fisheries. And if you can introduce experiences from other communities around them that would show, hey, guess what? It is possible to increase our fish stocks. It is possible to conserve the habitats, to create marine protected areas where people will pay to dive. It's possible to do well by doing good by the environment. And so people get proud of their contribution to their economies and to conservation. That's really what RARE is good at. And it's markedly different from the approach for generations that conservation has taken, where we name a big problem and we try to look for a bad guy and we want to beat everybody up about it and hope something changes. We believe that humans are really good at cooperation, they're really good at competition, and if we can inspire each other to see the potential for all of us to do better and then insert a few proven solutions, well, you can make a big difference.
RARE's conservation strategy is a new take on an old problem. In workshops around the world, RARE trains community leaders to design, test, and measure social marketing campaigns.
Let me unpack one of your notions, which is kind of flies in the face of just about everything. I mean, the old school was it's depressing, it's horrible, you find the bad guys, as you were talking about. But the other concept of marketing, that seems so corporate America, it's like counter to conservationists. Did you get any blowback when you first started down that pathway? Because I would think that that would just run counter to how some would see things.
You're right. It's really interesting when you describe being leading a conservation effort that is born of the same commercial marketing practices that you might say cynically would get you to buy a package of cigarettes even though it says on the label it will kill you, or to drink a can of sugar water even though you know it's linked to bad teeth and obesity and it's not very nutritious to begin with. But I think people generally understand, increasingly understand, we are moved by marketing. We buy the cars we buy. We look to the employers that we want to work for. We think a lot about our purchasing decisions, and we associate our values with those purchasing decisions. And so it's not sneaky in any way to simply say, why shouldn't we who are trying to protect the natural resources on which all those economies depend, or that our cultures in many ways depend, why shouldn't we use some of the same tools of influence as the corporate world? What's really interesting is when you start training local conservation leaders who are inspired to envision a different world, a more sustainable world, and who want to figure out how can they not be the only one in their village or the only one in their community or the only one in their congressional body who really wants to make change. They need help. They're looking for a toolkit. They're looking for ways to say, all right, how are we going to message the value of nature without disenfranchising everyone? How can we make this something that we can all believe in, whether it's restoring fisheries and protecting coral reefs, or reducing the downside of soy plantations in Brazil, or transitioning in China from traditional cotton to organic cotton. All of those, even if they're industrial practices, can be influenced using the basic practice of human behavior change. And so we feel like we're developing the intel inside for personal transformation around sustainability.
It's fantastic, but it doesn't sound easy.
Oh, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, the way we think about the level of difficulty is, I would ask you, how hard is it to get your children to do their homework every evening? What is it that you parents do that well in order to raise fit, emotionally intelligent, well, forget the kids. How good are we at controlling our own behaviors? How good are we at getting out of bed and getting exercise and managing our diets? How good are we at being compassionate and kind to those with whom we disagree? I think every single human is a work in progress by definition, and we have our challenges. We are weak beings at our cores, but people want to evolve. People want to change. We need to tap into people's aspirations. And so what makes conservation possible, I believe deep down, the only thing that makes conservation possible is recognizing that conservation is not about a technical solution, and it's not about creative finance. It is about all of those things, and most importantly, it's about people. We need to figure out how to motivate people to see that it is in our best interest to preserve, not just for the sake of looking at them, these beautiful places, but because our whole economy, our way of life, starts with the natural resources that we need to take care of.
In China, Xinjiang province accounts for 2/3 of the country's cotton production, but climate change has threatened both the soil and water quality. Rare worked with Chinese cotton farmers to put into place rotational farming and composting so that cotton could be grown organically.
China has industrialized so quickly that it has a problem with groundwater and groundwater contamination. It's really well recognized by the government of China, At some point I heard that as much as 80% of the fresh water of China is unsuitable for human consumption right now. Now, I'm not honestly sure how that compares to other industrialized nations, but we know in the United States we have similar problems in parts of the country. So China's certainly not alone in any regard. Changing the way that, for example, smallholder farmers farm cotton is something we're really excited about right now. There's a number of European and American cotton buyers. There's a growing market for organic cotton. So there's an economic opportunity that speaks to the minds and the rational side of a smallholder farmer in China. There's also a big environmental argument. Preserving the wetlands requires reducing the contaminants that flow into them. That means changing the agricultural practices upstream. So we have a new program in Wuhan province in partnership with the C&A Corporation in Europe. And together we're trying to double organic cotton production simply by transferring and transitioning traditional cotton growing practices by local smallholder farmers to organic. That takes about 3 years. It requires a lot of motivation, a sense of pride. There are some emotional drivers there. People want to feel like they're a part of the big future plan. And then it requires some, not just marketing, but some agreements with buyers who are willing to buy that transition cotton to create an incentive to drive adoption of this change. And so whether it's with the government of a province, whether it's with corporations inside or outside China, or just the farmers themselves, there is common ground, and converting to organic cotton is something that is a great microcosm of what is possible with food safety, water conservation, and then downstream, to answer your question, wetland conservation.
I think about when you look at it in its totality, you know, oh my God, global warming, all these horrible, hideous problems out there, pollution. How are we ever going to tackle that? And when you frame it that way, we look helpless. But when you frame it the way you frame it, it's hopeful. It's still, we still have the same issues, but you're saying we attack it locally, you can make a difference. Talk to me about that fundamental approach and how it's different.
Yeah, so over the last 25 years, there's been a big transition among what I would call the conservation world, from working at grassroots levels on what we might call little pilots to demonstrate that there's potential for change, to trying to figure out how to influence global industrial supply chains on the one hand, and government policy on the other. And you can see there are pros and cons to both of these approaches. If you simply focus on corporate supply chains, you've got to make sure that the corporations are really interested in changing, and that it can happen fast enough to address the unsustainable parts of the supply chain. If you rely on national level legislation, you need to make sure that what's going to follow is an appropriation. That doesn't always happen. What's going to follow is the implementation of the laws. And as soon as you move away from the more industrialized nations where you can count on the rule of law, you move into the areas of richest biodiversity on Earth with some of the most challenging governance issues. So we can't forget the power of local communities to not only show us what good looks like, to actually take charge and to address in their communities, in the watersheds around their communities, in the fields where they grow their food and their crops, whether they consume them or they export them. That is very fertile ground for not just little pilots, but for this growing revolution that says, show that it works. Governments and corporations are looking to help scale solutions that work, and eventually we both of these mindsets meet in the middle. So bringing that full circle, what RARE does is we are working, for example, on coastal fishery reform in 5 developing nations in a way that we believe can transform small-scale fisheries and feed sustainably 1 billion people while protecting most of the major marine resources globally. Huge idea. Then you look at what it actually looks like on the ground. And there's a couple local leaders in a community working with mayors, working with the local fishermen. They're inspiring the community to recognize they can have a sustainable fishery. They can preserve their reefs. Even with a changing climate and ocean acidification, they're going to have a better chance to do this. And then you get the fisheries ministers and eventually the finance ministers to buy into these ideas. And all of a sudden you're talking about local solutions at scale. It's a different way of thinking about conservation, but what it means is we're meeting people where they are, where they actually not only need help, but where they want to drive their own sustainable future.
As I listen to you, it reminds me of the speech by Robert Kennedy back in the 60s, the Ripple of Hope speech, where he said, each time a man strikes out for an ideal, he sends forth a ripple of hope, and they cross one another, and eventually they create a current. Is that basically, in essence, what RARE is all about? Creating these ripples around the world until there's basically not just a current, perhaps a tsunami?
I think that's right, and I think Robert Kennedy said it best. But I think over time, people have begun to get discouraged by what you might call pilotitis. How do we get out of this notion that we're just lighting a candle in the darkness? Hey, that's a hell of a start, and I wouldn't discourage anybody from doing that. But what we need is to build on Kennedy's famous rippling analogy. We need a wildfire of human recognition and behavior change. We need people to understand where they come from and where we're headed, and that our environment is job one, whether we recognize it or not.
Brett Jenks, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it.